Hello, and thank you for joining me today. Coming up in the news, the airlines are advocating legislation that would make it easier to get an ATP certificate, but at least one group is strongly opposed. There are lots of announcements flying out of the Paris Air Show this week. We'll talk about the ones that are general aviation related. And one airline just emailed their customers asking them to support ATC privatization. Plus, we're going to talk about the heat, how it affects aircraft performance and pilot performance. Plus, I'll give you my tips for dealing with the heat when you're flying. Plus, listener questions and email. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year to bring you news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And this is the last time I'm going to remind you the 2017 listener survey is live. I'm going to keep it open all month, but I'd like to find out if there are any ideas you have on how you'd like to see the show improved, or if you want me to just leave it exactly the way it is. Just take a few minutes to take the survey and let me know either way. You can go to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, or you can get to it by clicking a link in the show notes, and you can get to those by tapping on the artwork if you're using an iPhone. Otherwise, you need to go to the website. I'll keep the survey open through the end of June. Can't wait to hear from you. All this and more, and the news starts now. We're going to talk a lot about the heat today, first during the news and then during my pilot skills segment in the middle of the show. From KVOA.com, travelers could experience some major delays in their summer vacation plans this week because of intense summer temperatures soaring in Phoenix. American Airlines announced Monday that it has canceled its regional flights, approximately 30 flights, for Tuesday, June the 20th. They also say that customers can rebook flights or request a full refund by contacting the reservations line. Quote, "We continue to offer flexibility for customers who are scheduled to arrive and depart Phoenix June 19th through the 21st between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m., unquote, the company wrote in an email. An airline spokesperson says that aircraft that are operated by their regional partners at Mesa and SkyWest out of Sky Harbor Airport are CRJs, which have a limit of about 118 degrees. Other planes operated by Boeing can handle temperatures into the mid-120s, so those aren't as much of a concern. Heat has disrupted travel at Sky Harbor in Phoenix before. Back in 1990, Phoenix had 122-degree weather. Planes were grounded then because pilots couldn't take off since the temperatures listed in their flight manuals didn't go that high, so the pilots had no instructions on what settings to use. Now, from the Associated Press, they say the southwestern U.S. is about to feel the wrath of a punishing heat wave, and yeah, we're already feeling it. And that includes a forecast of 120 degrees for Tuesday in Phoenix. That's a temperature they haven't seen in that desert city for more than 20 years. The broiling temperatures will also be felt in Las Vegas and Southern California, creating a public health hazard. These rising temps are being closely watched by everyone from airline pilots and emergency room docs to power grid managers and mountain cities unaccustomed to heat waves. It goes on that even cities accustomed to dealing with 110-degree days are grappling with the new problems that arise from 120-degree days. Here are a few things that we know about the heat wave. First, 120 is rare. The underground weather historian Christopher Burt said Phoenix temperatures rose to 120 degrees only 3 times in recorded history, twice in 1990 and once in 1995. He said the city has hit 118 degrees 11 times, most recently last summer. But it could be worse. It's going to be 124 degrees in Death Valley on Tuesday. And when the temperatures soar, well, it's harder for airplanes to take off and land. And things aren't going to be getting better anytime soon. The outlook for the next 6 to 10 days is for above-average temperatures from a band of states that stretch from California through all of the southern states on the southern border of the U.S., up the East Coast to North Carolina. Hang in there, folks. It's going to be hot. And we'll talk about how to deal with that in the middle of the podcast when we talk about heat and what pilots can do about it. And from the Buffalo News, the story just came in a few hours ago. Flight 3407, you probably know that better as the Colgan air crash that occurred back in 2009. The Flight 3407 families may face off against a top Air Force general on pilot experience rules. It says the families, Monday, renewed their fight to preserve pilot experience requirements that they got written into the law 7 years ago, but this time they could be facing their most daunting opponent yet, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. General David Goldfein, the top uniformed officer in the Air Force, has been raising questions for months about whether the military is losing experienced pilots to commercial airlines because of that pilot experience requirement. He met last with industry officials a few weeks ago, and the airline started circulating a document on Capitol Hill calling for changes to the aviation safety measure. Speaking with reporters earlier in the year, Goldfein indicated that the rule, which requires most non-military pilots to have 1,500 hours of experience before being hired by a commercial airline, could be causing pilots to leave the military earlier than they would otherwise. That's because the law includes a lower threshold of 750 flight hours for military pilots who want to join commercial airlines. He says, right now, if you've got to have 1,500 hours to be a commercial pilot, I am a really attractive source. That's what Goldfein said to reporters in an account in the Stars and Stripes military newspaper. Now, you probably remember the February 2009 crash of Flight 3407. Federal investigators blamed that on pilot error. And what's really kind of odd about that is that both pilots had over 1,500 hours of experience, and yet the rule that came out of that was that commercial airlines could no longer hire anybody unless they had 1,500 hours of experience. So that particular crash wasn't really the result of inexperienced pilots. It was more the result of very tired pilots. But that's the way rules get made sometime, and now it looks like the airlines are looking to roll back those safety rules, and of course the people in Buffalo who lost their families are not at all happy about that. By the way, the current law allows credit toward the 1,500 hours for an ATP certificate from, quote, academic training courses taken at accredited aviation colleges and universities. And what the airlines would like to do is to broaden that definition so that classes they teach, and perhaps some other classes as well, would count toward a reduction in the total number of hours required to get an ATP. Also, in this proposal that the airlines are circulating around Congress, they would like to increase the incentives for military pilots to work with commercial airlines and expand student grants and loan programs. And of course, the key ramification for GA pilots who are working to get 1,500 hours so that they can get an ATP and work in the airlines is that there may be some changes afoot that would allow you to get credit for other courses and perhaps not have to achieve the total 1,500 hours before getting an ATP. And the latest update in privatization, well, the airlines are pulling out all the stops to try and push through ATC privatization. Last week, JetBlue sent out a letter to their customers. The email subject line was a message from JetBlue CEO Robin Hayes. The message: here at JetBlue, one of our biggest goals is reducing delays and running an on-time airline for you. As a Mosaic member, you're probably aware that air traffic control delays are caused by many things and can ripple across the system. Bad thunderstorms in Florida in the morning can actually delay flights in Boston or LA that evening if planes and crews are delayed or displaced. JetBlue operates in some of the busiest skies in the world. Today's air traffic control relies on outdated radar technology and relies on Congress and the federal budgeting process for funding 1 year at a time. This impacts our ability to deliver the best service and on-time performance. Fortunately, there is a proposal in Congress today, supported by the White House, travelers, and our air traffic controllers, that would move the air traffic control function away from the FAA and the constraints of the federal budget process to an independent, not-for-profit organization governed by a board of its users, including airports, airlines, general aviation, unions, and the government. This is not a novel idea. It has worked in more than 50 nations around the world, including Canada, the UK, Germany, and Singapore. In every case, it has enhanced efficiency, reduced delays, maintained safety, and reduced emissions. There's nothing we want more for our customers than to depart and arrive safely and on time, and we believe this is the best way to achieve our on-time goals. I hope you will join me and thousands of others across the nation and urge your members of Congress to support ATC reform. Just click the button below or visit, and they give a website to let your voice be heard. Well, folks, if there was any doubt in your mind, let it be really clear the airlines are going to do whatever possible to pass this proposal. And as we've said before here in the past, moving air traffic control to a private company, probably great for the airlines, probably not good for small airports and for general aviation because of the fees. Speaking of the effect on small airports, from govtech.com, an article reported from the Journal Star, which is a newspaper in Peoria, Illinois, FAA privatization debate presents problems for smaller airports. Changes at the FAA, effectively transforming the agency into a public-private partnership proposed by Donald Trump, have central Illinois lawmakers more than a little leery. smaller airports might not fare well under a plan that gives more power to companies, according to U.S. Representative Sherry Bustos. Quote, we're not Chicago, we're not Detroit, we're not Atlanta, we're not LaGuardia. Under privatization, where the whole mission of privatization is for the private sector to make money, my concern is what happens to smaller towns that are not heavily populated, that already struggle to make sure we have the flights we need to get the places we want to go, the Moline Democrat said. Their priority is not going to be places like Peoria and the Quad Cities and Rockford, unquote. And Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican from Channahon, Illinois, said that the public-private partnership under discussion has seen success in Canada and the U.S., but he goes on and says, what you notice in Canada and in Europe is they have a dead general aviation sector, he said. They charge user fees every time a guy with a Cessna decides to go fly, so it runs small people out of business. Ensuring that the airlines don't have unfettered control over a board in any public-private reform is also crucial, he said. Quote, if we're going to do this board, I don't want the airlines to have all the power, frankly. I'm pretty frustrated with the airlines right now. There needs to be many more seats for GA at the table. I think there needs to be a guarantee that there's going to be enough money for modernization of smaller airports that there's never going to be user fees on general aviation. So, folks, the debate continues. It looks like, we've got folks, especially in smaller towns, who are very much opposed to privatization. From AOPA, work continues to raise the profile of PIREPs, or pilot reports. Now, back in episode 6 on this show, we reported a story in Flying Magazine by senior editor Rob Mark that was called NTSB Calls for Changes to PIREP Creation and Dissemination Education Efforts. And in it, he explained that pilots are providing relatively few PIREPs, particularly during good or as forecasted conditions. Many of the board's recommendations focused on education for pilots, flight instructors, flight service station personnel, and air traffic controllers to help them better understand the vital role their efforts or the lack of them play in accident prevention. Well, now AOPA says that they are working to enact some of these safety recommendations from the NTSB, which they believe could elevate the filing of pilot reports from a chore considered a low priority task by most pilots to an action as routine as shutting down the engine after a flight. Quote, AOPA has had discussions with FAA Flight Service, the private flight service contractor Leidos, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association to express our support for the NTSB recommendations, said Rune Duke, the AOP Director of Airspace and Air Traffic. Quote, we plan to work collaboratively on implementing the recommendations to ensure GA has a simple process to submit PIREPs and that more are entered into the system correctly. To address the need for a greater appreciation of PIREPs by those responsible for distributing them, AOPA has drafted proposed changes to the procedural guidance used by air traffic controllers and flight service specialists. AOP believes the guidance provided to those in the field can be clearer as to the value of PIREPs and how entering a PIREP in the correct format is important. Turning now to international news, and wow, most of this is flying car news. This comes from Flying Magazine. French pilot Bruno Vezzoli crossed the English Channel in a flying car. The French company Vaylon, that's Vaylon, has developed a flying car with the military in mind. Now, the picture of this, just to give you an idea, looks kind of like a four-wheeled dune buggy, but with a large propeller in the rear, and it's suspended under a parachute, and they call it Pegasus. So after putting this vehicle on display at Paris on Tuesday of last week, Vezzoli took to the skies on a 50-minute trip from France to Dover in England. He was joined in the sky by several paramotors that filmed and photographed the journey, but the pilot also checked in live on Facebook to share the flight and the landing with his friends and family. The vehicle's combination of stealthy paraglider and off-road vehicle gives it the advantage of being able to traverse difficult terrain, which would make it beneficial to military forces, humanitarian teams, or even researchers in the desert. According to the company, their original prototype was powered by a Rotax 912 engine, which allowed it to reach a top speed of 60 miles per hour on the road. In-flight Pegasus can travel up to 50 miles an hour using a pusher propeller for a flight that can last 3 hours. As recent as 2016, the company was looking to sell these stealthy aircraft to the U.S. military. Well, they say it's stealthy, but I would imagine it's probably not all that quiet. In other international news, the Paris Air Show started on Monday of this week, and while most of the announcements are related to the airliners and military, there were some general aviation announcements. From Flying Magazine, and this was from last week prior to this show, they said that AeroMobil, that's AeroMobil, in April, unveiled their latest iteration of his flying car, and they're going to show the latest version this week in Paris. They say they're going to produce a limited edition of 500 vehicles of this $1.2 million flying car. They say that it will transform into flight mode from automotive mode in 3 minutes. It has a driving range of 435 miles, an in-flight range when you're flying it of 400 miles, and a cruise speed in flight of 140 knots. Now, the company crashed an earlier prototype in May of 2015, but the test pilots survived after that flying car entered an unrecoverable spin because they were able to deploy its whole airframe ballistic parachute. So let's hear one more for the parachute, a really good idea. Now, in other news, in episode 5, we talked about E-Volo. That's the 2-seat vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, which uses 18 motors and propellers, which are mounted vertically on a circular frame above the cabin. Well, a German company introduced that at the Friedrichshafen show back in April. According to AvWeb, they've now signed an agreement with the government of Dubai to test fly autonomous air taxis in that emirate by the end of this year. The company announced on Monday at the Paris Air Show. Now, Dubai's Roads and Transport Authority said that it expects the trials to continue for about 5 years, during which all operational aspects will be assessed, including security, safety, and rulemaking. Also at Paris, Workhorse Group, a U.S. company, unveiled a prototype of its own personal hybrid helicopter VTOL concept aircraft called the SureFly. The SureFly design features 4 propeller arms, each with 2 fixed counter-rotating propellers, a backup battery to drive the electric motors in the event of engine failure, and a ballistic parachute. SureFly says that it's capable of carrying a pilot and passenger or cargo up to 70 miles. Early models are being pilot-operated, but the company said its goal is to have autonomous models and that flight testing will be expected by the end of this year. Well, my own personal opinion is that flying cars represent a bubble and that most of these will not be successful in the market. A few of them probably will, so we're not going to be reporting every single flying car story that comes along in the future. And also from Europe comes this story that FlyHonda has a program that allows owners to fly their fractional jets. One of the unique selling points of Europe's new FlyHonda fractional ownership company is the opportunity for properly certified owners to climb into the left seat of a new aircraft when they book a trip. FlyHonda is the only fractional ownership company that allows owners to actually fly their aircraft. Based on the Isle of Man, FlyHonda accepted delivery of its first Honda jet in late 2016 and recently placed an order for 4 additional new aircraft. One new aircraft arrives later this summer, with 2 more due before the end of the year. The company's business model calls for owners to purchase a 25% share of the aircraft, with FlyHonda retaining one of the quarter shares to facilitate operations. FlyHonda is the first company in Europe to manage a Honda jet, they say, and they hope to become the leading facilitator for the purchase and management of Honda jet aircraft. According to GMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Honda Aircraft Company has delivered 38 of these aircraft worldwide since certification in 2016. The Honda jet is priced at $4.9 million, meaning that a 1/4 share is slightly more than $1 million. And this story comes to us from Flying Mag. And turning back to news here in the United States, General Aviation News tells us that AOPA offers an ADS-B selection tool. With the FAA mandate for ADS-B out fast approaching, requiring owners to install transponders by January 1st, 2020, aircraft owners need to understand their options. That's why AOPA has on its website an ADS-B selection tool that will help aircraft owners determine the best solutions for your aircraft and where to fly. Now, I actually came across this tool last week as I was preparing the stories that we had about owners who were asking about ADS-B solutions, and I didn't mention it at the time because to me it looked like it hadn't been updated in the last few months and it was missing a few tools. But since General Aviation News has mentioned the story, I thought I would bring it to you because even though the tool didn't look like it was complete, it did have a lot of great information and probably would be a good starting point for you, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes. And finally, from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Cirrus Aircraft will outfit Lufthansa with 25 aircraft for their training fleet. The Duluth-based Cirrus Aircraft is selling 25 of its propeller planes to Lufthansa for their flight training program. Lufthansa Aviation Training will use Cirrus Advanced SR-20 aircraft as its primary training fleet in Goodyear, Arizona. Plane delivery begins in October and will finish in February. Now, Cirrus officials noted that the partnership with Lufthansa Aviation Training marks another milestone in its small airplanes being used to train pilots around the globe. Other customers include Emirates Airlines, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the Royal Saudi Air Force. And by the way, just to put this in perspective, this is the second large fleet sale they've had this year. Earlier in the year, they announced a sale of 10 SR-20s back in March to Southern Utah University. Now, together, those two orders represent about 10% of their total planned production for this year, and that's already pushed some of the deliveries for their new aircraft out into 2017. So from what I hear, if you were to try and order a new Cirrus today, you're probably going to be looking at a wait of at least 8 months. So business is good at Cirrus. That's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we talk about hot weather and steps you can take to get the best performance from the plane and the pilot when it's hot outside. Plus listener letters. One listener asked, is it legal to fly using GPS on a VOR approach? We'll be right back. And welcome back. We'll be talking about extreme heat in just a moment, but first, I wanted to talk about the listener survey. I'm getting lots of great information already. For example, one listener said he'd like to have a little bit less reading of the news and a little bit more commentary and insights from my perspective about the news, and hopefully you heard a little bit more of that today. If you like that or don't like that, go ahead and take the survey. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. We've got through the month of June to get your inputs. Now, I've also asked for the last few weeks for people to send in any questions about basic med, and you know what? I haven't heard from anybody. So I'm guessing either the listeners don't have much experience with basic med, or maybe it's not on your radar screen and you're not really concerned about it. Either way, let me know. Send me a note. Go to aviationnewstalk.com/contact and let me know how you feel about basic med. And this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about several different ways you can support me, and I bet you know what they are already. First of all, you can tell a friend. Tell them about the show. Show them how to subscribe to a podcast if they don't know how to do it. Another way, of course, to do it is to leave a review on iTunes, and I found some international reviews that I'll be reading today. And the third way is if you're up there in the clouds and you don't want to be sitting there wondering which buttons to push, well, go ahead and sign up for one of my online courses at pilotlearning.com. I have courses up there for the G1000, both for VFR and IFR operation, and for folks flying the latest GPS and WAAS capable approaches, such as LPV and LNAV plus V. Well, we've got a GPS and WAAS course for you there as well. Course costs range from $59 to $79, or you can take all of the courses for just a monthly membership of $29.95, or sign up for the entire year for $299, which is the same as getting 2 free months. And if you sign up for the full year, you'll get a 1/2-hour consulting call with me on any topic you'd like to discuss. Okay, today we're going to talk about hot weather, how it affects airplanes and general aviation pilots, and steps that you can take to mitigate the effects of the heat. Now, this is really timely because we're having record temperatures here in California and in the Southwest, including Arizona and New Mexico. And I think I mentioned during the news that the 6 to 10 day outlook is for temperatures to be above normal for that band of states stretching from California along the southern border of the U.S. and then north along the East Coast through North Carolina. Now, typically during flight training, pilots are really only required to study information about density altitude, which are the effects of non-standard temperature and non-standard pressure on aircraft performance. However, some pilots rarely get to actually encounter some of these kinds of severe conditions that we currently have. So I thought we'd start by reviewing some key facts about density altitude. Also, since pilots are not required to study anything about how hot weather affects pilot performance, we'll then talk about a few practical tips that you can use while you're flying in hot weather to make sure that you as a pilot stay fit and are able to deliver your best performance when it's really hot outside. So as a quick review, I want to remind you that density altitude affects the performance of 3 different parts of the aircraft. When I ask pilots about this, most of them remember that the engine puts out less power at high density altitude because there's less air going into the engine. But what they often forget is that the higher density altitude also results in the wing generating less lift. That's because, of course, there's less air moving over the wing. And the propeller is also less effective as it tries to generate thrust by cutting through the thinner air that's found at high density altitudes. So let's review density altitude and aircraft performance. Air density is affected by changes in altitude, temperature, and humidity. So for altitude, you can also think changes in pressure. High density altitude then refers to thin air, while low density altitude refers to dense air. Now, the conditions that result in high density altitude are high elevations, low atmospheric pressure, high temperatures, high humidity, or some combination of these factors. Conversely, lower elevations, high atmospheric pressure, low temperatures, and low humidity are indicative of low density altitude. And if you have trouble remembering that high humidity results in a higher density altitude, just remember this. If you take a volume of air, when it's really humid, it forces the air molecules further apart to make room for those water molecules. Therefore, when you have humid air flowing over an aircraft wing, there are fewer total air molecules moving over the wing, and therefore the wing will generate less lift when it's flying through humid air. Now, typically, most aircraft performance charts are based just on pressure, altitude, and temperature, and they don't even take into account humidity at all. That's probably because most charts and tables are only plotted in 2 dimensions, and it would be difficult to add humidity as a 3rd dimension, unless, of course, you had a computer, which would make it really easy to handle all 3 dimensions. Now, we'll talk first about pressure and temperature, and then talk about how to account for humidity. First, it's important to remember that you're very unlikely to get the same performance that you're going to find in the performance charts in an aircraft POH. That's because those charts were created by using a brand new airplane with a new engine flown by a test pilot. So you can expect that you will have to add a significant fudge factor to these charts. And if you find that after running the numbers that you can just barely make the flight work, well, you definitely should not fly. Because remember, flying safely is all about having lots of extra margin in every aspect of flight. And if you need the maximum performance of your aircraft, then you really shouldn't fly, as you're unlikely to get the maximum performance that's listed in the charts. Now, when the weather is hot, the performance charts that most pilots are most likely to check are the takeoff distance charts. That's because pilots don't want to run out of runway when they're taking off. No surprise there. And they might also check the landing distance, especially if they're landing at a shorter runway with high-density altitude conditions. But there's one chart they often forget to check, and that's the climb rate chart. Yet that's typically the chart that pilots get into trouble with during high-density altitude situations. Let me give you an example. Here in California, we have mountains that go up to 14,500 feet. That would be Mount Whitney. And the Sierra Nevadas, which stretch up and down the entire length of California, they rarely go below 10 or 11,000 feet except for a few mountain passes. Now, the vast majority of accidents that I have seen in the mountains did not occur during the takeoff because most mountain runways are relatively long. However, these aircraft got into trouble a few minutes after takeoff because they were not able to outclimb the terrain. So when I do mountain checkouts for pilots and we look at the climb rate performance, we find that typically it's only about half the climb rate that we get at sea level. Now, that might be sufficient in perfect conditions, but it doesn't in any way account for the downdrafts that are very common on the mountain, especially when the wind starts to blow. Therefore, whenever I'm doing a mountain checkout, I like to get out there early in the day and ideally be out of the mountains before 11 a.m. when the wind starts to kick up. Now, from what I've seen, most pilots do a reasonably good job of calculating aircraft performance using temperature. However, the majority of them seem to make the same serious error when they're selecting the pressure altitude in the chart. So typically on one axis of a chart or one part of the table, the altitudes are shown in thousands of feet. So if we were going to, say, the South Lake Tahoe Airport, which has a field elevation of about 6,200 feet, many pilots would use 6,200 feet for the table, but that's not correct. Unfortunately, a lot of pilots seem to overlook that the chart says pressure altitude, or they don't know what pressure altitude is, and that is not the field elevation. Now, the definition of pressure altitude, if you've forgotten, is really simple. In fact, so simple, once I give you this definition, you really probably will never forget it. Here's what pressure altitude is. It's the altitude you read on the altimeter when you set the altimeter to 29.92. So to calculate pressure altitude, you need to know the current pressure at the airport where you are either landing or taking off. If you're flying into a towered airport, then you can get the current pressure from the METAR, which is the current weather observation for the airport. Or if you're flying into a non-towered airport, you can often get the pressure from an automated weather station at the field, which is often available over a radio frequency that you can listen to from the aircraft. And these automated weather stations are generally known as AWOS or AWOS. Now, once you have a current pressure, you then need to convert it to pressure altitude. Now, there are conversion tables published in places like the FAA's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge and in the front of the performance section of virtually every airplane POH. But there's also a very simple conversion that you can make that's reasonably accurate, and you don't need a chart to do it. Here's what you need to remember. Near sea level, 1 inch of pressure equals about 1,000 feet. Of course, we have 29 inches of mercury, so just assume the first 1,000 feet, you would lose about 1 inch of pressure. And the other thing you want to remember is that aircraft like high pressure better than low pressure, because high pressure means there are going to be more molecules of air flowing over the wing. So to do the conversion, you just simply subtract the current pressure from 29.92 and then multiply the difference by 1,000. So let's have an example here. Let's say the current pressure at South Lake Tahoe is 29.62 inches of mercury. So subtract that 29.62 from 29.92, which is standard pressure, and you get 0.3. Then multiply the 0.3 times 1,000. That gives you 300 feet. Now all you need to know is whether to add or subtract that 300 feet from the airport elevation. So getting back to South Lake Tahoe with a field elevation of 6,200 feet, if the pressure is 29.62, that's lower than normal pressure. And since airplanes perform more poorly in low pressure, that means you're going to have to add the 300 feet to your field elevation to get the pressure altitude, because the aircraft's going to perform more poorly, which would be the equivalent of being at a higher altitude. Therefore, we'd add that 300 feet to the 6,200 feet, which would give us a pressure altitude of 6,500 feet at South Lake Tahoe when the pressure is 29.62. Now, that would be the figure, 6,500 feet, that you would use for the altitude when you're calculating your performance at the airport. Of course, you'd have to also know the temperature, which would be the other factor used in most aircraft performance charts. Now, none of these charts factor in humidity, but I'm aware of one resource that does account for humidity, and the author told me about it 6 or 7 years ago when we met at AirVenture, the large EAA event in Oshkosh, Wisconsin every summer. So this document was written by Alan Davis, who's a master CFI, and it's located on the website for SAFE, which is the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators. SAFE is the professional society for flight instructors. So if you're a CFI, I strongly encourage you to join them. And their website is at safepilots.org. Anyway, in his article, Alan pointed out that on a standard day, we all know that 15 degrees C and 29.92, would be standard. But what you probably don't know is it's also 0% humidity. So part of a standard day, the definition is zero humidity. And he says that he was reading a quiz article in a magazine, and the quiz was written by Barry Sheaf, so that tells me it's probably AOPA Pilot Magazine. And he said that Barry asked a question that he'd gotten from another pilot, and the answer to that question gave reference to a humidity calculator on the web, and it mentioned that the effective humidity can be greater than is generally appreciated. So Alan says he went out to the military website, which, by the way, he says has since been taken down and is no longer available, and he found several calculators there that he found interesting, including one for density altitude, if you had inputs for altitude and air temperature and altimeter setting and humidity. And he said there was, of course, the caveat there on the calculator that it was for educational purposes only, and it should not be used for flight planning. So he went on to say, I'll spare you all the numbers that I ran through the calculator, but he said several general concepts emerged. He said, I did numbers for sea level, 3,000 feet and 5,000 feet using temperatures from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while keeping the pressure constant. He said what surprised him was that humidity did make density altitude go up, but it did so more so at lower altitudes and higher temperatures. In other words, he said the percentage increase in density altitude and thus decrease in performance due to humidity was greater at lower altitudes than higher ones, and also at higher temperatures than lower temperatures, neither of which he said were particularly intuitive. He said, for example, at sea level and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, density altitude went up 3.2% for every 10% of humidity increase, for a total of about 32% increase in density altitude when humidity was at 100%. So the key takeaway, he said, is that humidity can further decrease performance from about 11% at high altitudes to as much as 32% at lower altitudes, above and beyond the effects of just temperature and altitude alone. By the way, I mentioned that aircraft typically get into trouble after they take off from the runway, and that's exactly what happened with an aircraft that had departed the San Jose, California airport maybe 15 years ago. It was, as I recall, a Piper Saratoga that was heavily loaded, and it took off from San Jose without incident, and then it landed at an airport in the high desert in Southern California. I'm thinking it was, William J. Fox Field or, somewhere in that vicinity around Lancaster. Of course, it was much hotter there, and after the aircraft refueled and took off again, it was barely able to climb out of ground effect. Now, my recollection is the aircraft gained maybe 50 to 100 feet off the ground and was headed toward rising terrain. And witnesses on the ground reported seeing luggage being thrown from the aircraft in an attempt to increase its climb performance, but sadly that didn't solve the problem and the aircraft crashed into rising terrain. So here are some tips for flying on hot days or in high density altitude. Note that these are in no way a substitute for getting a mountain checkout from an experienced flight instructor. And first, remember that you are unlikely to get the same performance that you'll see in the POH performance chart. So to improve your performance, you may want to travel with less weight. Often I see pilots automatically fill up the tanks whenever they land, but you really should think twice about doing that if you're taking off from a mountain airport. On hot days, it's best to fly in the early morning or late afternoon, and I like to be done flying by 11 a.m. in really hot weather. Now, you must definitely watch your aircraft temperatures during the climb. In particular, pay attention to your cylinder head temperatures, or CHTs. Most mechanics would recommend keeping these temperatures below 400 degrees Fahrenheit if possible, and never to exceed 420 degrees. And yes, I know the POH for many of these planes says the maximum is 460 degrees, but your engine is probably not going to be happy operating at those kinds of temperatures for long. If you do find your CHTs rising above 400, there are really just three things I know you can do to cool the engine. The best thing is to climb at a slower rate. So if you're climbing up at 600 feet per minute, try climbing perhaps at 400 feet per minute, because that'll increase the airflow through your engine. Of course, with those low climb rates, you might not be able to outclimb the terrain, so you may need to circle as you climb before turning toward your destination. Another thing that you can do is to enrich in the mixture, provided that you were running a rich of peak, which is how most aircraft are operated in climb. Of course, if you're already running the mixture full rich, then there's not much you can do with the mixture to cool the engine further in a climb. Some aircraft, such as turbocharged Cirrus SR-22s, have a provision for climbing with the engine at lean of peak. Now, this generally requires the aircraft to be flown at speeds greater than 130 knots, and the climb rate shouldn't exceed 500 feet per minute. Now, this procedure works sometimes on cooler days, but I haven't had any success with it on hot days, so therefore I usually climb these aircraft with mixture at full rich. Now, the last thing you can do if the temperatures are rising is to open the cowl flaps if the aircraft is equipped with them. You'll find these on Cessna 182s and 206s and lots of other aircraft. Of course, typically the cowl flaps will already be open during climb, so this is only going to help if you happen to forget them and then decide to open them later. Now, many pilots seem to think that they can cool the engine in a climb by pulling back the throttle and reducing power. Now, this almost always has the opposite effect. Remember that when you're operating with a mixture full rich, that you're putting excess unburned fuel into the engine, and it's that excess fuel that helps remove heat from the engine. If you reduce the throttle, you reduce the fuel flow, and therefore there's going to be less excess unburned fuel to help cool the engine. Okay, let's change gears now and let's talk about what you as a general aviation pilot can do to mitigate the effects of the heat on yourself when you're flying in hot weather. Let's start with a pre-flight. You really should try and keep yourself and the airplane covered until you're ready to start up the engine. If you're lucky enough to have a hangar, then keep the airplane inside the hangar during the pre-flight with the hangar doors open. And if you're parked outside, try and invest in a cover or sunshades for the windows. These will greatly reduce the temperature inside the cabin. And what I usually do is I'll leave the windshield sunshield in to the very, very end. And just when we're ready to go, I'll pull that. It's amazing how much it reduces the heat inside the cockpit. Now, if you have to be out in the sun, you really want to try keeping cool by wearing light-colored clothing, whites and light blues and things like that. Don't wear, dark-colored clothing. Try and use sunscreen and definitely bring a hat. And most importantly, drink lots of water and other fluids. But you really shouldn't be drinking things with caffeine or alcohol because those are not going to help keep you cool. Now, if you're lucky enough to have air conditioning, well, as soon as you get the engine started, go ahead and turn on the air conditioning. But if you don't have air conditioning, and I know most GA aircraft don't, you might think about investing in one of the portable swamp coolers that you can buy for use in an aircraft. These are essentially ice chests like you might bring on a picnic, but they've been modified with a built-in fan and a couple of different ducts. The fan draws hot air in over the ice that you load the cooler with, and it blows cooler air out the exhaust. And one of my clients recently told me that he has one, and he said it works great. But if you don't have air conditioning or you don't have a swamp cooler, well, keep the windows or the door open on the ground. But of course, don't forget to close them for takeoff. And also in some aircraft, you can open a window in flight, which will provide you more cooling, which is something I do on really hot days. And of course, we mentioned before, water. You really need to drink lots and lots of water. For longer trips, I carry a Camelback, and I use a trick that I learned from a client when she bought a Diamond DA-40 and we flew it back together from Florida to California. Every morning, she would fill the Camelback with as much ice as could fit in it and then fill it with water. Well, now I do the same thing. And this gives me enough water for the entire day, and usually there's still some ice left in it at the end of a 8-hour flying day, so the water will stay cold all day long. Now, in terms of clothing, I have a long sleeve fishing shirt that I throw on in hot weather, and I do that just to protect my arms and my neck from sunburn. And I'm not sure it's the best possible solution, but it's the one that I've chosen. It's got built-in UV protection. It's lightweight, and I'll even tell you what it is. I got it from Columbia.com. It's called Performance Fishing Gear, PFG. So it's the men's PFG Bahama 2 long sleeve shirt. And no, I'm not getting any benefit if you order one of those. I'm just telling you what I use. So these light color clothes reflect the light, and they really reduce the amount of absorption you're going to get from the sun's rays, and that's going to let you be cooler and decrease the potential for heat-related illnesses. By contrast, if you're wearing dark clothing or dark hat, the sun is basically going to be absorbed by all that clothing, and it's going to keep your body from being able to regulate its core temperature. Of course, use lots of suntan lotion. And if you have a low-wing aircraft, you might want to use some of the sunshades that you can stick onto the inside of the window to block some of the sun that's coming in. Okay, and here's a trick that I've never told anybody about, but occasionally a few people have seen me doing this. On really ridiculously hot days, I'll take a paper towel, I'll put a few ice cubes in it, I'll wet the towel slightly, and then I'll put the whole thing inside my hat. So yes, underneath that baseball hat, there's a little bit of ice, a little bit of water, and boy, that will keep you nice and cool for about an hour. And this works best if you're teaching all day, because after every lesson, you can come in and replace the ice in it for each lesson to help keep you cool. Now, from an AOPA article, they say that when you sweat, that means that water and salt are being lost, and if you're not sufficiently hydrated, your body's ability to cool diminishes, which can lead to heat exhaustion, as well as feelings of being unwell, tired, weak, dizzy, or nauseated, or having muscle cramps. And they say you could even pass out. So if those are not big enough warning signs, these should get your attention. Intense thirst, dark urine that's of smaller volume, and a racing pulse. They say left untreated, heat stroke can ensue. And they say when the body loses the ability to cool itself, internal temperatures soar and seizures can follow. So if you suspect heat exhaustion, get into a cool environment promptly, remove clothing, lie down, drink fluids, and fan the moist skin to help promote heat loss. If heat stroke is suspected, immediately seek medical attention. So best thing to do, stay out of direct sunlight, be cognizant of rising temperatures, and drink plenty of fluids. And once again, they say beer does not constitute a fluid. They say alcohol actually dehydrates the body, and it interferes with temperature regulation, which is not going to be helpful when you're trying to stay cool. So those are my tips for how to stay cool as a pilot. If you have some tips you'd like to share, go ahead and send them to me. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/contact and send me an email. Coming up in a moment, listener feedback on whether you can turn off a transponder when you fly, and listener questions on can you use GPS on a VOR approach, and how we know if the meters are accurate at the fuel pump when we're buying gas. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Hey, before we get to listener mail, a quick thank you to people who posted reviews of the show in iTunes this past week. And I just found how I can access reviews that have been posted over the last 2 months in other countries outside the United States. So let me read a couple of those. And from Australia, Brett said, if you have time for only one, this is it. He says, great work, Mr. Trescott. Really enjoying the podcast. You've captured the right mix of broad aviation news weighted toward GA. Cheers from down under, Brett. And from Germany, Marcus says, great start. Wow. Keep it going, Max. Always like the Airplane Geeks podcast, but this is a bit more from the heart and gives me that certain let's sit and chat feeling. Very well structured, educational, charming to the ear. Great start. Well, that's kind of you, Marcus. Thanks so much. And 3 reviews here this past week in the United States. I'm not going to read all of them, but I want to thank ZZ the Day, Partree, and Mike from Tennessee for your reviews. And let's just read a couple of lines here from ZZ the Day. He says, I can't tell you how many podcasts on aviation I have tried and gave up on. Quite a few that gave up publishing too. But I really think this is the right mix. Yes, we like to have the news, and it's essential to learn something from podcast, or I am easily bored. Keep up the good work. Well, thanks so much for that review. So let's talk about some listener feedback that came in over the last week or two. If I haven't said this before, I think we have some of the smartest listeners out there, and you'll see that from some of this. So first from Greg H. in Indiana. He's referencing episode 15, which was last week, and he says, you talked about a listener's ADS-B options and traffic displays on ForeFlight versus the Garmin G1000. And just to kind of dial back to that, I believe I said that I really like the display of traffic in the Garmin G1000 because I can drop out all the background clutter and just see the targets. And I hadn't seen a display like that in ForeFlight. He says, the split-screen feature in the Garmin Pilot app has a traffic display option that looks very similar to the traffic display page on my Garmin 530W. Enjoy the podcast. Keep up the good work. And yes, I had seen that long ago, but totally forgot about it. So, Greg, thanks for bringing that to our attention. And 4 listeners wrote in to talk about ADS-B, privacy, and whether or not you can turn off the transponder, topics we had discussed last week in episode 15. So I'd like to thank Paul from Mountain View, California, our fair city, also CFII Drew, and Bill M. from Vermont, and George from Richmond. Let me just go ahead and read the letter from Paul, since that captures most of it. He says, I was listening to your Aviation News Talk podcast discussion of ADS-B and privacy, the ADS-B TSO for UAT. Now, that's the lower frequency version. And he says, not 1090 ES, specifically supports anonymous mode, where it can transmit a random anonymous code. FAR 91.227D8 regulates when that anonymous code can be used. I have not heard of any ADS-B out manufacturers who support this feature, but I'd be curious if you can find out if any do. He says, also, you're suggesting on the podcast that a pilot wishing anonymity can turn off the transponder violates 91.215C, whether using ADS-B or just Mode C or even Mode A. And yes, I vaguely remember that, and I should have researched that before I made that comment on the show. He continues, except in the Class G airspace, if there's a transponder, then it must be on. And then he followed up and said, I just searched the web, and at least Garmin's GDL88 supports this ADS-B anonymous mode. And then he gives a link from the manual. So I want to thank everybody for writing in on that particular topic.
Hi Max, this is Roland from the UK. First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting podcast. I'm not a pilot myself, so forgive me if this is a dumb question. In the episode about fuel starvation, you mentioned that you only know how much fuel is in the tanks by knowing how much you have put it in the first place. My question is, are the fuel gauges at the pump certified to be correct? Thanks a lot.
Roland, thank you so much for recording your question. And anybody else who wants to record a question, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Question, and then you can speak your question. Roland, the first thing you said was whether or not it was a dumb question. And most flight instructors I know try and tell everybody there is no such thing as a dumb question. The reason we say that is we don't want to ever discourage anybody from asking any question about aviation. Who knows, any particular little fact could save your life someday. So please ask all the questions you have. I thought that the fuel pumps were certified, so I went and checked with the fuel supplier at Palo Alto, California. And it turns out that local counties here in the United States are largely responsible for weights and measures. So here in Santa Clara County, there is the Santa Clara County Weights and Measures Group, and I was told they go out to the airport about once a year, and they test all the meters on the fuel pumps to make sure that you're getting the accurate amount of fuel that you have purchased. So yes, always look at the number of fuel gallons that have been delivered to you from the pump, because you'll almost always certainly have more than that because of whatever residual fuel that was in the tank before you purchased fuel. And listener John H. emailed in asking about using GPS on a VOR DME approach. Now, I'm sure many of you know that some approaches are going to be labeled VOR or GPS. He's talking specifically about the ones that just say VOR and don't say GPS in the title of the approach. He says, Max, yesterday in my Turbo Commander, which has a Garmin 950 and an STEC 2100 autopilot, I did the VOR DME runway 35 approach at KOLM, which I looked up, and that's the Olympia Airport in Olympia, Washington. And he continues, okay, I was with a co-pilot CFI, it was IMC, and I did the complete approach in GPS mode. Worked great, but when I landed, the CFI said, nice job, John, but it was illegal. Okay, so I went back up, did the same approach, flew over the VOR, dialed in course of 095, waited until I got to McKen, then turned the plane 90 degrees south and started incrementally dialing the course knob, this time with the green needle, guidance only by the DME from the OLM VOR, did the arc, and turned toward the final on a heading of 356, which he says would be the 176 radial out of OLM. Okay, fine. Did it legally, but wow, I've got to be honest with you, the weather was closing in, getting bumpy, and I'm turning the course knob every 10 degrees or so, staying on the arc, then flying the airplane old-fashioned, no autopilot, and yes, I did it, but if the FAA is concerned with safety, what the heck? The GPS was much more accurate, much less stressful, and plus, it seems to me if you have to do a mist, it sure seems to be easier to already be in GPS mode. And this turns out to be a great question because the answer has changed. John's CFI was correct, but I wrote back to him, hi John, there's a new rule as of 2016 that makes it legal to fly a VOR approach all the way to minimums using just GPS as long as you are monitoring the VOR signal. So you could use your autopilot coupled to the GPS to fly the entire VOR DME runway 35 approach at Olympia, as long as somewhere in the plane you had the VOR tuned and displayed on a CDI. The new text is in the AIM, that's the Aeronautical Information Manual, in paragraph 5 of AIM 1-2-3. And number 5 says, use of a suitable RNAV system as a means to navigate on the final approach segment of an instrument approach procedure based on a VOR, TACAN, or NDB signal is allowable. The underlying nav aid must be operational, and the nav aid must be monitored for the final segment course alignment. John says, when he replied, he says, may I ask, is a bearing pointer enough to qualify? And I wrote back to him and I said, John, I had to give that some thought, but I'm confident the answer is yes, you could use a bearing pointer to monitor the underlying nav aid. The key phrase is nav aid monitored for final segment course alignment, and you can do that with a bearing pointer. You just need to continually check that the tail of bearing pointer points to the radial that you're trying to track. You can definitely stay aligned on the course segment with a bearing pointer if you interpret it properly. Well, that wraps it up for this show. We had lots of listener mail. Couldn't get to it all, but I'll try to do it next week. Hey, take a moment if you can. Give me feedback through the listener survey. You'll find it at aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Or if you're using an iPhone or iPad, just touch the artwork at the top of your screen and you'll find a link to the survey. You'll also find links where you can record a listener question or send me an email. And if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me. I can help you with that evaluation and even help you fly your new aircraft home. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. Hey, and if you enjoy the show, tell your friends, or if you really like it, leave a review in the Apple Podcast app or sign up for one of my courses at pilotlearning.com. In the meantime, fly safely, have fun, keep the blue side up, and see you next week.